All right, so strap yourselves in, folks. Today, we're diving into some pretty murky waters. We're talking about the fallout from all those investigations and prosecutions of former President Trump. But there's a twist this time.
Yeah, what really sets this apart is, well, the timing of it all.
Yeah.
We're not just looking back at what happened, but now we're dealing with the repercussions with Trump back in the White House.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's almost like, we're stuck in some kind of legal and political time warp. We have Special Counsel Jack Smith's final report, which just landed on the Attorney General's desk, covering both the election case and the classified documents case. But all of this is happening after the cases were dismissed. And why were they dismissed? Well, because Trump is back in charge. That's why. And just to add another layer to this whole crazy situation, we've got a letter from Trump's lawyer objecting to the entire report.
It's like something out of a legal thriller, right? A special counsel report that's released after the cases are gone, and then the guy who was investigated is now, well, he's leading the very government that investigated him.
Let's talk about awkward. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, could you give us a quick rundown of why Smith was appointed in the first place?
Sure. So, back in 2024, there were these two massive controversies surrounding Trump. The first one was, well, his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. And then there was the whole issue of those classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. Things were getting pretty chaotic, with accusations flying everywhere. So the Attorney General appointed Smith as special counsel to look into both of these matters, independently.
And all of this was going on while Trump was running for president again.
Yep, that's right. Which, as you might imagine, raised a ton of questions about, possible political influence. Smith was very careful to emphasize that any decision he made, like whether to charge Trump or not, was his decision alone. He really hammered home the point that he wasn't being influenced by the Biden administration, trying to maintain public trust and all that.
Gotcha. So we've got the background, but let's get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
What did Smith actually find?
Well, the report is set up in 2 volumes. The first one dives into the election case. It really digs into whether Trump and his allies, knowingly used those false claims about election fraud to mess with the electoral process and ultimately, try to stop the certification of Biden's win.
That's what everyone's been buzzing about, right? Did Trump know that he lost, but was still trying to hang on to power?
Exactly. And this is where the report gets really interesting. Smith's team interviewed a whole bunch of people. We're talking about a lot of Trump's own advisors, campaign staff, you name it. And what they found was, well, pretty damning. The report kind of paints this picture of Trump being told over and over that these claims about widespread fraud were just not true.
Wait a minute. You're saying people close to him, people on his side were telling him this?
Oh, yeah. And we're not talking about just a couple of people. It was coming from all sorts of sources at different times, all saying the same thing. Those fraud claims, nope, not true. The report even gives specific examples. Remember Trump claiming there were like 5,000 dead people voting in Georgia?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Well, his own campaign advisor, and even the Georgia's Secretary of State, who is a Republican, by the way, told him that was totally wrong. But Trump, he kept repeating it anyway.
So it wasn't just, random people online feeding him misinformation. It was people he trusted, people in positions of authority telling him the truth.
You got it. And that makes his actions even more questionable. The report kind of suggests that by keeping on with these claims, even though he knew they were bogus, Trump might have been deliberately trying to cause chaos and undermine, people's trust in the election process.
Wow. That's a pretty serious accusation.
Oh, it is. And it goes to the heart of what the special counsel was trying to figure out. Did Trump act corruptly to try and stay in power, even if it meant potentially, harming our democracy?
Okay, so we've got this mountain of evidence suggesting Trump knew his claims were bogus. What was his defense? How did he explain all this?
Well, his legal team has always maintained that everything he did was protected by, free speech. They argue he has every right to express his opinions, even if they're controversial or based on, well, let's say, iffy information. And the report does acknowledge that point, the free speech part.
So where's the line? When does free speech become, well, something more sinister?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something the report really grapples with. It seems to come down to intent. Simply voicing concerns, even if they're unfounded, might be protected. But if you're knowingly spreading lies to incite violence or to obstruct official proceedings or to undermine the whole foundation of our government, that's where things get tricky.
It's like yelling fire in a packed theater when you know there's no fire. Your right to free speech doesn't shield you from the consequences of causing a panic.
That's a great analogy. What the report seems to be saying is that Trump's words and actions, they went beyond just expressing his opinions. They were potentially part of a deliberate effort to overturn a legitimate election.
And just to throw more fuel on the fire, we have Trump's lawyer's letter, right? He's not just disputing the findings, he's questioning the entire validity of the report.
Yeah, he's not holding back at all. It's a pretty scathing response. The lawyer argues that the report should be completely withdrawn since the cases have been tossed out. He claims it's full of false accusations, things that have already been discredited, and even includes conduct that the Supreme Court has said is immune from prosecution.
Hold on, back up a sec. What does that even mean? Immune from prosecution?
Yeah, it gets kind of deep into legal stuff, but basically there are certain things presidents can do while they're in office that can't be prosecuted, even if those actions might be considered wrong in other circumstances. The Supreme Court has some pretty specific guidelines on this, and Trump's lawyer is saying that some of what's in the report falls under that immunity umbrella.
So he's saying that even if some of the stuff in the report is true, it doesn't really matter because Trump can't be held legally accountable for it.
That's basically the gist of it, yeah. And then he goes on to say that releasing the report violates Trump's, presumption of innocence. He says it serves no real purpose and is basically just a political attack meant to tarnish Trump's reputation.
And of course, he brings up the timing of it all, right? The fact that all of this landed just as Trump is getting ready to step back into the White House.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that the report is a huge distraction and interferes with the whole transition process. He even says that releasing reports in cases where charges have been dismissed goes against the norm. It's like he's saying, look, this is totally unprecedented and completely unfair.
So on the one hand, we've got the special counsel laying out potential wrongdoing. And on the other, we have Trump's lawyer firing back with legal and procedural objections. It's a mess. But what does it all mean for, regular people like us who are trying to understand what's going on?
That is the key question, isn't it? This whole thing, it's not just a legal battle, it's a battle for public opinion, and we're right in the middle of it.
All right, before we get too deep into that, let's take a step back and really focus on what the report found, especially in the election case. There's a lot to unpack there, and I want to make sure we're giving it the attention it deserves.
You're right. That's where the real heart of the story lies. And there's this one particularly fascinating part of the report that I think will really shed some light on Trump's state of mind during those crucial weeks after the election. The report actually goes into detail about the types of people who were telling Trump that his election fraud claims were baseless.
Okay, this is kind of what I was getting at before. It wasn't just like a few random folks,
Yes.
right? We're talking about people in his inner circle.
Yeah, exactly. And not just a few either. The report lays out how time and again, people from different parts of Trump's world, his loyalists, campaign staff, even high-ranking government officials, they were all telling him the same thing. Those fraud claims, not true.
Man, that's got to be tough to hear, especially when you're so convinced you're right.
It would be tough for anyone, yeah. But imagine being the president of the United States and you've got all these people around you saying you're wrong.
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to some serious cognitive dissonance. But, does the report say that Trump was, deliberately ignoring these people? Or could he have actually believed what he was saying, even with all the evidence pointing the other way?
That's the big question, right? Was it willful ignorance or actual delusion? The report doesn't come right out and say what Trump's intentions were, but, well, let's just say it lays out a pretty compelling case for a certain pattern of behavior.
A pattern of behavior. Tell me more.
Okay, so the report points out specific instances where Trump was presented with clear evidence debunking certain claims, and then, what did he do? He kept repeating those same claims publicly. And we're not talking about minor details here. These were some of his most explosive allegations, the ones that really got his supporters fired up.
So, even after being told point blank by people he trusted that these claims were false, he just kept pushing them anyway. That seems pretty deliberate, don't you think?
It definitely suggests that, yeah. The report uses phrases like, despite being informed and was aware of, when it's describing Trump's reactions to being contradicted.
Yeah.
Those aren't really the words you'd use for someone who's genuinely mistaken.
Right. It's one thing to be misinformed. It's a whole other thing to stick to a story even when your own people are telling you it's wrong. Makes you wonder what was really going on in his head.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the core of the election case, Did what Trump did actually amount to an attempt to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power?
Well, if he knew he lost, but kept pushing those claims, knowing they were false. That seems like a pretty open and shut case to me.
You'd think so, yeah. But remember, Trump's lawyer completely denies any wrongdoing. He argues that Trump truly believed he had won and that he was just, fighting for what he thought was right.
Ah, the classic, I was just being a patriot defense.
Right. Yeah, it's a pretty common tactic, especially in cases like this. But the report doesn't just focus on Trump's words. It goes through a detailed timeline of all his actions, showing how he put pressure on state officials to overturn the results, how he tried to put together those alternate slates of electors, and how he ultimately pressured his own vice president to reject those electoral college votes on January 6th.
Sounds like he was trying every trick in the book to stay in power.
Yeah, that's definitely the picture it paints. The report presents all of these actions within the context of those knowingly promoted false claims of fraud. It's pretty damning, but like we've said, it would have been a fiercely contested case in court if it hadn't been dismissed.
Yeah, it's almost like we're stuck in this weird in-between space. We have this really detailed report laying out potential crimes, but then no actual legal resolution. It feels incomplete, like we're missing the end of the story.
It does, doesn't it? And that's part of what makes this whole situation so unique. We're used to seeing investigations play out in court with a judge or jury deciding guilt or innocence. But here, we're left with this mountain of evidence and, well, no real answers.
So what are we supposed to do with all of this? What's the takeaway for, regular folks trying to make sense of it all?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think the answer is going to be different for everyone. Some people, they'll read the report and be totally convinced that Trump is guilty. Others will see it as nothing but a political witch hunt. And then you've got folks who are somewhere in the middle, not really sure what to believe.
It's like we're being asked to be our own judge and jury.
In a way, yeah. And that's a lot to put on someone's shoulders. But it's also a good reminder that justice isn't always black and white. It can be messy, complicated, and open to interpretation.
And in this case, it's all tangled up with politics, media spin, and our own personal biases, too. No wonder people are having a hard time figuring out what to think.
It's definitely a lot to process. But I think the key is to approach all of this with a critical eye. Don't just take the headlines or the sound bites at face value. Read the report yourself, consider all sides of the story, and try to form your own conclusions based on what's actually presented.
Easier said than done, I guess. But I get what you're saying. We can't just blindly follow whatever narrative each side is spinning. We got to engage with the information ourselves and try to figure it out.
Exactly. And even then, it's okay to not be totally sure, to have questions, to wrestle with all the complexities. This isn't some simple case with easy answers. It reflects the deep divisions we have in our society and the challenges we face as a country.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the election case, but we've also got that whole other part of the report dealing with the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. Can we talk about that a bit?
Sure, we can definitely get into that. That's a whole other can of worms, and it brings up a bunch of questions about presidential power, national security, and, the whole idea of the rule of law.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What exactly were these classified documents doing at Trump's resort? And why was it such a big deal?
Well, the thing is, after leaving office, Trump took a whole bunch of government documents with him to Mar-a-Lago. And some of these documents, they were highly classified, dealing with really sensitive national security matters. And that's a big no-no. There are really strict laws about how classified information is supposed to be handled, and former presidents, well, they're not exempt from those laws.
So it's not like he could just check them out of the White House library like some overdue books.
Not exactly, no. These documents are supposed to be stored securely, and only authorized personnel are allowed to access them. Having them just sitting around a private resort, well, that raises all sorts of red flags, like what about potential leaks, security breaches? Who else might have had access to this stuff?
Yeah, I can definitely see why that would be a concern, especially given the kind of information we're talking about. But what did Trump say about all of this? Did he say he, accidentally packed them up with his golf clubs or something?
He gave a few different explanations, but none of them were really very convincing. At first, he said that he had declassified everything before he left office. The problem with that is there's a specific process for declassification, and there's no proof that he actually followed it.
So it's not like you can just snap your fingers and say, poof, these documents are declassified.
Nope, definitely not. Those procedures are there for a reason. They're meant to protect sensitive information and make sure people are accountable. And declassifying something, well, that doesn't mean it's suddenly not sensitive anymore or that it's okay to just leave it lying around a resort.
Right. It's still government property, and there are rules about how it needs to be handled.
Yeah.
So if the declassification thing didn't work, What else did Trump say?
Well, he also claimed that he was allowed to take the documents because of the Presidential Records Act. This act basically says that presidential records belong to the government, not the person who was president, and that they have to be given to the National Archives when their term ends.
So he was saying he could take the documents because they technically belong to him, even though the law specifically says they don't.
Yeah, it was a pretty twisted argument, and it didn't really hold up. The law is pretty clear. These records have to be transferred to the National Archives, not stored in a former president's basement or, private resort.
Okay, so we've got Trump making these weak excuses about declassification of the Presidential Records Act. But what did the special counsel's investigation actually find? Did they uncover evidence that Trump was purposely trying to hide these documents or, like, block the government from getting them back?
That's where it gets even more interesting. The report goes into a whole pattern of behavior that suggests Trump and his team were really working hard to avoid cooperating with the National Archives and the Justice Department.
What kind of behavior are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, they just ignored requests to return the documents over and over again. Then when the National Archives started getting more insistent, they only gave back some of the records, like they were trying to hold on to the stuff that was most sensitive.
So it wasn't just a case of forgetfulness or being disorganized. It sounds like there was a deliberate effort to hide something.
That's the sense you get from reading the report. And it gets even more suspicious when you think about where these documents were stored at Mar-a-Lago. They weren't exactly kept under lock and key in a super secure vault or anything.
Wait, so where were they?
Some were found in a storage room, others in Trump's office, and get this, some were even reportedly tucked away in a bathroom. Not exactly what you'd expect for top secret government documents, right?
That's wild. It sounds more like a college dorm room than a former president's place.
It does, doesn't it? And the report emphasizes this lack of security as proof that Trump wasn't taking the right steps to protect this super sensitive information.
Okay, so we've got ignored requests, incomplete sets of records, and documents stored in a bathroom. It's starting to sound like a bad spy movie. But how did Trump defend all of this? He had to have some explanation for why these documents were scattered all over his resort, right?
He did offer an explanation, but it wasn't very convincing. His lawyers claimed that he had a right to have the documents at Mar-a-Lago because it was his home, and he needed them for his personal records.
His personal records. What kind of personal records involve top secret government information?
Good question. And it's one the report doesn't really answer. Seems like a pretty weak excuse, especially considering the types of documents we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not buying it either. Sounds more like he's just trying to deflect responsibility rather than offering a real explanation.
That's the feeling I got too. And the report seems to suggest that this whole pattern of, stalling and misleading, it was all part of a deliberate effort to obstruct the government's investigation.
So it wasn't just about mishandling documents. It was about trying to cover it up.
Right.
That takes things to a whole new level.
Exactly. And that's why the special counsel decided to file charges against Trump. They felt they had enough evidence to prove that he had intentionally obstructed justice and broken the laws about handling classified information.
Wow. Okay, so we've got one report, two separate cases, and a whole bunch of legal and political stuff to untangle. It's hard to keep it all straight. Can you give us a quick recap of the main points before we go any further?
Sure thing. So in the election case, the report found evidence that Trump was repeatedly told his claims of fraud were false, but he kept promoting them anyway, potentially trying to block the peaceful transfer of power.
And in the classified documents case, the report goes into detail about a pattern of behavior suggesting that Trump and his team were actively trying to hide these documents, mislead investigators, and basically stop the government from getting them back.
Exactly. And remember, in both cases, Trump's lawyer insists that nothing wrong happened, saying the report is biased, inaccurate, and politically motivated. It's the classic he said, she said situation, but with incredibly high stakes.
It's like watching a legal drama unfold in real life, but with the future of our democracy hanging in the balance. So what happens next? Trump's back in the White House, the cases are gone, and there's no clear path forward. What does this all mean for the future of holding presidents accountable for their actions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the truth is, there isn't an easy answer. This whole situation is completely unprecedented, and we're all trying to navigate uncharted territory here.
It feels like we're stuck in this strange legal and political limbo. Trump is both the target of the investigation and the head of the very agency that investigated him. Talk about a recipe for conflict and confusion.
It definitely is. And it raises all these questions about how the Justice Department will handle this going forward. Can they really be impartial when they're investigating their own boss? Will they be able to resist any pressure to protect Trump from further scrutiny?
Yeah, it puts them in a really tough spot. And it creates a real crisis of confidence in the system. If people start thinking that the Justice Department isn't really an independent body anymore, but just a tool for the president to use, well, that undermines the whole idea of the rule of law and erodes people's trust in our institutions.
Absolutely. That's a dangerous road to go down.
So what are the options here? What can be done to address this and make sure that presidents are actually held accountable for their actions?
Well, there are a few possibilities, but none of them are easy or straightforward.
Let's hear 'em. What's on the table?
One option is for Congress to step in. They could launch their own investigation into the stuff covered by the special counsel's report, which could potentially lead to, impeachment proceedings. But given the way things are politically right now, that seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah, it's tough to imagine a Republican-controlled Congress holding their own party leader accountable,
Mm.
especially now that Trump's back in power. So what else is there?
Another possibility is that state-level prosecutors could pick up the slack. Some of the stuff that allegedly happened took place at the state level, so it's possible that state attorneys general could file charges against Trump or, people who worked with him.
That's an interesting thought. That would certainly be one way to bypass the federal government and potentially hold Trump accountable, even if he's got presidential immunity.
It's a long shot, but it's not totally out of the question. We've already seen some state-level investigations into Trump's business dealings, so it's not impossible that they could expand those investigations to include some of the things mentioned in the special counsel's report.
Okay, so we've got Congress, state prosecutors. Any other options?
Well, there's always public opinion. Even if Trump never faces any actual legal consequences, the findings in this report will definitely follow him throughout his presidency. The media will keep digging into these things and reporting on them, and in the end, it'll be up to the public to decide whether they think Trump is fit to be president.
It's a reminder that democracy isn't just about elections and laws. It's about norms, values, and those unwritten rules that are supposed to guide our behavior. And when those norms get broken, it's the people's job to hold their leaders accountable.
Exactly. The real power lies with the people, and it's up to us to decide what kind of future we want for our country.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone through the special counsel's report, the evidence it lays out, the arguments from both sides, and what it all means for our democracy.
It's been a fascinating conversation, even if it is a bit sobering.
It definitely has. And I have a feeling we'll be talking about this for years to come.
I think you're right. This report and everything surrounding it will definitely shape the political and legal landscape for a long time.
So for our listeners, what's the one thing you want them to remember from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to stay engaged, stay informed, and never take our democracy for granted. What we've seen over the past few years has shown us just how fragile our system really is, and it's up to each and every one of us to protect it.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
Oh, my pleasure.
So we're talking about potential obstruction, mishandling classified info, and a former president who's now back in the Oval Office. It's like my head's spinning.
It is a lot to process, yeah. We can't forget that, we're not just dealing with the actions themselves, but also the consequences now that, well, the whole situation has changed so drastically.
Exactly. The cases were dropped because Trump is back as president, so there's no real legal closure.
Yeah.
But this report is out there now,
Yeah.
and people are definitely talking. What do you think the impact of this is going to be?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I have a feeling this report is going to be a major problem for Trump, even without any legal consequences. It's going to give his opponents more fuel, give him ammunition for future investigations, and it'll be this constant reminder to the public about, well, all this potential wrongdoing.
I can see that. Every time Trump makes a decision, especially about national security or the Justice Department, people are going to be thinking back to this report and asking, can we trust him? Did he learn anything from this?
Exactly. It creates this cloud of suspicion that's going to be really hard to get rid of. And it puts the Biden administration in a tough spot, too.
How so?
Well, they got to walk this fine line between, upholding the rule of law and not looking like they're just trying to get revenge. They can't ignore the findings of this report, that's for sure. It would make it seem like they're giving Trump a free pass.
But if they come down too hard on him, it could backfire and make it look like they're just trying to settle old scores.
That's right. It's a tricky situation, and I'm not sure there's a perfect answer.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory, honestly. We've never had a president who's been the subject of such a, damning report, only to come back to power and basically be in charge of the agency that investigated him.
It is a very unique situation, and it raises some big questions about, accountability, transparency, and how much power a president really has.
Okay, let's talk about accountability. What are the realistic options for holding Trump responsible for what he did, given that the cases have been dismissed?
Realistically, the options are pretty limited. Like we talked about, Congress probably won't investigate, especially with the way Congress is made up right now. State-level prosecutions could happen, but they have their own hurdles to overcome.
So what's left? Public pressure, media scrutiny. Is that enough to hold a president accountable?
At this point, it might be all we've got. This report, even without any legal power behind it, it can definitely shape public opinion, influence the media, and maybe even have an impact on future elections.
It's like a political time bomb just waiting to go off.
Yeah,
Even if it doesn't explode legally, it's going to have consequences.
I think that's a great way to put it. This report reminds us that actions have consequences, even if those consequences don't happen right away or aren't super obvious.
It also reminds us that we, the people, we have a role to play in all of this. We can't just sit back and expect the courts or Congress to hold our leaders accountable. We have to stay informed, think critically, and speak up.
I agree. Democracy isn't just about watching from the sidelines. It takes active participation and a willingness to hold those in power to a high standard.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this whole situation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we're at a really important point in our history. What's happened in the past few years has really tested our institutions, shown us our weaknesses, and forced us to face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It's up to each of us to decide what we learn from all of this and how we want to move forward as a country.
It's a pretty sobering thought, but it's also empowering in a way. We have the power to shape our future, to demand better from our leaders, and to build a more just and fair society.
That's right. And I hope this report and the conversations that come from it will encourage us to do just that.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been fascinating and given us all a lot to think about.
The pleasure was mine. Thanks for having me.
It's